S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl is one of my favorite games of all time. It's an open-world FPS from 2007 with a remarkable atmosphere and a dangerous but captivating world. It was far ahead of its time, and it's one of the few single-player experiences that I still occasionally replay once in a few years. But today we are not going to talk about the games that most of us have played. Instead, I want to show you Shadow of Chernobyl that hasn't seen the light of the day. This game is a notorious victim of its own ambitions and hype. By many accounts, it was a great and innovative experience, but it was developed for a long 6 years, and during that time, this game went through a lot of major and sometimes dramatic changes. Changes that many fans didn't like because developers promised them something completely different. And today we are going to try to understand why this happened and what exactly went wrong. Shadow of Chernobyl development story is fascinating for many reasons, and removed content is not even the craziest thing about it. Such drastic overhauls during the course of the game development is not something unique, but in most cases the general public will never know about them. Most publishers and studios prefer to not reveal their games in the early stages of production, because there's always the danger of setting expectations too high. Not delivering all promised features, or simply not making the game good enough in the eyes of the fans can badly backfire on the release date. And despite the common misconception, in most cases such changes could happen not because greedy developers were lying on purpose to trick players into buying the game. Game development is hard and often requires making difficult compromises to create something that people will enjoy playing. And that's what developers of Shadow of Chernobyl have learned the hard way. By the year 2001, GSC Game World, the studio that created S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise, couldn't have been considered as completely inexperienced developers. They just released their first game, the real-time strategy Cossacks European Wars, that has become a massive hit, both critically and sales-wise. Because of such a huge success with their debut game, the studio became more confident and announced Shadow of Chernobyl just a few months after the beginning of its development. To be fair, it's worth clarifying that back then they were developing something completely different, and it had almost nothing in common with the games that we've got in the end. No one could have imagined that this project would change so much after the initial announcement and would require 6 years to finish it. And in the case of Shadow of Chernobyl, we have a unique opportunity to follow all those changes, step by step. Unlike other documentaries about Shadow of Chernobyl, in this video we are going to focus on alpha and beta versions of this game. I've played through almost 100 of those unfinished builds and prototypes from different years of Shadow of Chernobyl development. In order to recreate a clear timeline for the events of those 6 years, I've also read dozens of interviews and post-mortem articles related to this game. And now I'll try to show you the most important milestones in the story of how Shadow of Chernobyl has been created. You'll see features and locations that went through several redesigns or even were completely removed from the final version of the game. This video is aimed to give you a better understanding of the phenomenon of this series and why it's beloved by thousands of fans around the globe. And even if you are not very interested in the S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise, this documentary can give you an interesting insight into how video games are being made. It's going to be a long journey, so get comfy and enjoy the story about how a small team from Ukraine made one of the most unique first-person shooters of all time. It all started back in 2001, when GSC announced their new game that was called Oblivion Lost. It was supposed to be a futuristic team-based first-person shooter, made on a brand new X-ray engine. This gameplay footage that you can see right now is the first known alpha build of Oblivion Lost that has number 749. It was basically a prototype compiled in April 2001 that has a single level and a bunch of placeholder assets that were taken from other games. For example, the only weapon that is available in this build is a railgun from Quake 3 Arena. In the game's resources there are 3D models and sound files for other guns, like a rocket launcher and some mysterious M-gun, but they were not enabled in this build. The only map that is available in 749 is unknown Aztec ruins. By default the level is empty, but after a slight edit of the script files, you can spawn a few aliens with rudimental AI. Judging by the code, those aliens were known as Jumper and Mover, probably because of their behavior pattern. Those enemies have never appeared in any other build again, and they were disabled in 749 by default, probably because of the fact that colliding with them is causing an application crash. Considering that this is one of the first versions of the X-ray engine, a lot of basic stuff is not finished, and the highest possible screen resolution that is available for this prototype is 1280 by 1024. The game featured both first and third person camera modes, but in 749 there was no character model yet, so basically you were playing as a floating railgun. Funnily enough, in this build the water was a surface on which you can walk, so we are probably playing as some sort of Holy Spirit. Okay, jokes aside, the next known build of Oblivion Lost has number 756 and dated June 2001. It's another tech demo with a few empty levels for testing a helicopter vehicle. Those maps were almost identical to each other, had a simple terrain and helipad with animated texture. This build has almost no sound effects, but at least this time they've added a character model. It was taken from codename Outbreak, another FPS game made by GSC that was released in 2001. This game and Oblivion Lost actually had a lot of similarities, but they were made on completely different engines and by different teams within the studio. The player's model had no movement animations yet, but helicopter physics and controls worked just fine, and it even supported different camera modes. Another Oblivion Lost build with number 788 was shown at the European Computer Trade Show in September 2001. This build is interesting because it was the first time when the game was shown to the public. It was not supposed to be playable. The camera in this build has a predefined path and it's flying around the level in a loop to showcase X-ray engine capabilities. So it's possible to remove these restrictions and enable free movement around the demo level. Apparently there was a minigun with barrel spin animation. This weapon briefly appeared in first S.T.A.L.K.E.R Oblivion Lost prototypes, but it was eventually cut from the game a few years later. Worth mentioning that 788 was also used for testing helicopter AI. I guess that's the reason why this tech demo is occasionally crashing after a few minutes of playing it with removed camera restrictions. The last known build of Oblivion Lost was compiled in February 2002 and had number 1098. This build had 3 different versions that were compiled on the same day. The first 2 prototypes were mostly similar, while the last one had a few major differences. Unlike the first and second versions that have a male player model and FN F2000 as the alternate weapon, in the third build the protagonist was female and had Groza assault rifle instead. Worth mentioning that there is another gun in the game resources that is called Protector, and it's a shotgun that later appeared only in S.T.A.L.K.E.R Call of Pripyat, and yet it was already here, back in 2002. As for the gameplay, this build was supposed to be shown on another Western trade show, so it was the most polished playable demo of the original Oblivion Lost concept. It has a proper HUD with a radar, life bar and ammo counter. Character animations in third-person mode were improved as well. The only NPCs that you can find in 1098 are robots that were called automatic support modules. In this build, they are presented as both allies and enemies of the player and have basic but functional AI. There is also the commands list for units from your squad, but looks like it doesn't do anything and was just a placeholder. The only available map in this build had Aztec ruins that were similar to those that we've seen in 749. It also included an underground part that you could explore, but outside of wandering around and shooting a few robots, there was nothing else to do in this build. Initially, the storyline of Oblivion Lost was supposed to be about some military research team that was traveling and exploring alien worlds. It was going to be a linear story-driven FPS game with a lot of cutscenes and dialogues between the team members. Developers planned to make at least 15 levels in completely different environments, including huge futuristic cities and tropical wildlands. Oblivion Lost was going to have drivable vehicles like helicopters and hoverboards, and on each planet you were going to fight unique types of enemies. But after weak sales of codename Outbreak, that was also a sci-fi FPS with team-based gameplay, the development team has started to feel that the original concept was not as exciting as they imagined at first. Shortly after presenting build 1098 to the public, GSC decided to completely rework the concept of the upcoming game. After a short consideration, the team has chosen the roadside picnic novella by Boris and Arkady Strugatsky as a new source of inspiration. And that's how Oblivion Lost was reborn for the first time. Once the work on the new concept for the game has started, to highlight those changes, GSC decided to add the S.T.A.L.K.E.R abbreviation to the title. There is a lot of fun theories about what this acronym stands for, but the truth is that it doesn't have any real meaning, and dots between the letters were added to avoid potential copyright issues. Oblivion Lost has remained in the title because GSC already spent resources on marketing the game and didn't want to waste them completely. Initially, there was no mention of the Chernobyl exclusion zone in this new concept, but instead, the game was supposed to take place in Crimea. Developers planned to write a story that takes place in the alternate universe, where the Chernobyl disaster has never happened and the construction of a nuclear power plant in Crimea was successfully completed. But shortly after, a mysterious catastrophe happened, polluting and locking down the entire peninsula. This concept of the zone was close to what we've seen in the final game, but the terrain was supposed to be completely different. Maps were going to have a lot of mountains and canyons with rivers and dense forests. Cutting out the terrain behind the mountains was going to help in rendering massive levels with the X-ray engine. But in March 2002, after watching a documentary about the Chernobyl disaster, Sergei Grigorovich, the CEO of the company, insisted on scrapping the Crimea setting and replacing it with something more familiar to a wider audience. At first, the team was strongly against this change, because they thought that making a game about such a recent catastrophe was inappropriate. To prove his point and give inspiration to the team, Grigorovich took a few key developers of Oblivion Lost on a trip to Chernobyl exclusion zone. Together, they visited the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the abandoned city of Pripyat with its outskirts. The team was deeply impressed by what they've seen, and after that journey, there were no doubts anymore about what game they wanted to make. In May 2002, the dev team compiled the first alpha version of S.T.A.L.K.E.R Oblivion Lost. Build 1114 was proof of a new concept, and it was shown to the public for the first time at E3 2002. This tech demo has two levels: the factory that will later become the part of Agroprom Research Institute, and the first version of the cordon. The factory level has two variations with daylight and sunset skyboxes. This map was used to showcase enemies like rats, military and zombies, and they've already had rudimental AI. The third-person camera is still there and allows us to take a look at the new protagonist model that was used in all early marketing images, including the thumbnail of this video. Along with some of the old weapons from Oblivion Lost, like minigun and F2000, In this build were added new familiar weapons like LR300 and AKA-74. For minigun, it was the last time it was available during the gameplay. The audio and texture files for this weapon remained in the resources during the whole development and were removed only closer to the release date. Here is another fun fact about this build. On the texture of F2000 you can see a joke message from the developer, which basically says, "What are you going to do today? Don't tell me that you are going to work." The cordon in this build is quite different from what we've got in the end. Despite skyboxes with Pripyat and Chernobyl nuclear power plant, in 1114 it still had this Crimean terrain from the first concept of the zone. Unlike the factory level, it was completely empty and had no spawned NPCs. The starting point was in another factory that was placed on the top of the hill. This building was eventually removed from the final version of the map, but it was shown in many official gameplay videos and promotional art. Another build that was prepared for public demo had number 1154 and was shown at Games Convention that took place in Leipzig in August 2002. It also featured 2 levels, but the map with the Agroprom factory was significantly expanded and received the scale that remained mostly the same until the release date. The level of detail on the cordon was improved as well, with slight differences in terrain. For example, the factory from the previous build was moved from the top of the hill to the ground level. By the way, the footage that you can see on TVs in the final version of the game was recorded in this build. The AI system was slightly expanded as well. Humanoid enemies learned some advanced tricks, like rolling and lying down on the ground. Developers also did additional work on improving the sound and graphics capabilities of the X-Ray engine. But the most important addition of this build was drivable vehicles, or to be more correct, a car model instead of the protagonist. At this point, the vehicle system was completely separate from the normal gameplay and looked kinda weird with its slow field of view and crazy car physics. During the year 2002, the dev team was busy with building and improving the technical foundation for the future game. X-Ray engine received multiplayer support and a new physics system based on Open Dynamics engine. GSC also partnered with NVIDIA to optimize and showcase S.T.A.L.K.E.R Oblivion Lost on their latest graphics cards. After completing the work on the design document, which described all story details and planned gameplay features, the team started to actively add the new levels and other content to the game. The next build that is worth mentioning was compiled in March 2003 and had number 1465. It was shown to all major Western publishers at Games Developers Conference, and that's how the game was noticed by THQ. A few months later, it was officially announced that THQ will publish S.T.A.L.K.E.R Oblivion Lost on the global market. For this build, developers improved the vehicle system. They've added a visible character model for first and third person camera modes, car physics and controls were adjusted as well. On-foot and vehicle gameplay were still separated, but it was a major milestone for the dev team. Another important addition in this build is a new map that is known as Garbage, and despite its name, it has almost no resemblance to the levels that we've got in the final game. Everything was completely different, from terrain and landmarks to color scheme and atmosphere. In 4065, instead of the square shape that it had in its final version, this level was more linear. It's so weird that this map has changed so much, while the Agroprom remained mostly untouched during all those years. Lastly, in this build for the first time were introduced anomalies and radiation damage. There's also textures of the bolt in the game resources, but it was not available during the gameplay yet. Anomalies in this build were invisible, so the only way to recognize them was Geiger counter sounds. The usage of bolt and particle effects for anomalies were added only a few months later in the next build. Another playable tech demo was prepared for E3 2003, and it's interesting for several reasons. One of the things that make build 1472 so important for our story is the first appearance of one of the most iconic locations of this series, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Unlike in the final version where this level was split into two parts, here it was a single map that has an impressive scale and level of detail even by modern standards. At this point, the power plant was mostly empty, with a bunch of lonely stalkers that were supposed to showcase the work of the new artificial intelligence system. The AI in the S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise is known as alive, and it was one of the most ambitious features of the upcoming game. Developers were going to make an ultimate open-world simulation, where all characters were living their own life and weren't fully dependent on the player's actions. Stalkers were supposed to freely roam around the game's world, take missions from traders, and even compete with the player for artifacts. The simulation was separated in local and global planes, and it was supposed to create a unique and unpredictable experience for every player. In this build, Alive was in its early stages of development and worked only on a scale of a single level. But humanoid NPCs already knew a few tricks, like picking up weapons and ammo from the dead bodies. Another important feature of build 1472 is a new level that was known as Dead City. It was a mid-sized map with a lot of unique buildings, and the player could enter and explore most of them. In early design documents, this place was supposed to be the base of Freedom, the first faction that was added to S.T.A.L.K.E.R Oblivion Lost. Funnily enough, you can also find photos of developers in the Hall of Fame that is located on the town square. Dead City has appeared on several promotional screenshots, and it was supposed to play a significant role in the main storyline. We'll talk more about this map once it will appear again in the late beta versions of the game. Next in the line, build 1475 from July 2003, which is highly unstable because it was made specifically for testing Alive. But it's important for our story because it had a lot of content that was cut from the final version. Firstly, in this build, developers tested the AI of Chimera, a mutant that appeared for the first time only in Call of Pripyat. Looks like this mutant was close to completion, but if you'll try to kill that thing, the application will crash. The vehicle system got another overhaul, and now the player should have opened the doors before entering the car. But for some reason the physics were changed as well, and this made it almost impossible to drive around. Also, in build 1475 the dev team has added the first version of the player's inventory screen. At this point, the inventory had an ammo belt section, a 3D preview for selected items, and options to sleep, eat and use anti-rad. Unlike in the final version of Shadow of Chernobyl, in this build the anomaly detectors and knives were available as objects that you could equip. The ammo belt and equipable anomaly detectors were removed from the game only closer to the release date. The main highlight of this build is the Rostok factory, and it was not the same Rostok that was represented as Wild Territory and Bar in the final game, but a completely different map. According to old design documents, this level was supposed to be a nest of bloodsuckers, mutants that eventually became a trademark of the S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise. At this factory, the player even had to fight the most dangerous and experienced bloodsucker in the zone. Fun fact, this map is almost an identical copy of the real factory with the same name that can be found in Kiev, Ukraine. Though it's not that surprising, considering that for several years GSC office was based here. It was carefully recreated in the game, with a bunch of fun details like the door with a nameplate that mentions Sergei Grigorovich as a director of this factory. In the end, this level has not appeared in the single-player campaign, but it was not completely removed from the game. Instead, a few years later it was reworked into the map for a multiplayer mode, and it was available in all currently released mainline S.T.A.L.K.E.R games. Lastly, in build 1475 made the first appearance another later removed map that is known as Generators. This level contains mysterious sphere-shaped objects that were presumably the reasons for emissions, or as they also known, blowouts. It's an extremely dangerous storm which was going to occur unpredictably during the game, but in Shadow of Chernobyl they were left only as scripted events. The other notable landmarks of this map were the village with a cemetery and the military base with entrance to the underground lab. This laboratory is known as X18 and was also available in this build as a separate level, though from what it looks like it didn't change much. In the final version of the game, the entering point to this lab was moved to the Dark Valley, and it was the first abandoned laboratory that the player was visiting on his journey. As for Generators, this map has appeared on several promotional artworks, and not just for Shadow of Chernobyl, but Clear Sky as well. But this level has never been available in the mainline S.T.A.L.K.E.R games, and Generators themselves were moved later to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Another important milestone in our story is the build 1511 that was prepared for Games Convention 2003. It had mostly the same content as the previous prototype, with exception of 3 new levels that are familiar to the fans of this series: Nuclear Power Plant Undergrounds, Army Warehouses and the Red Forest. At this stage, the last 2 maps were incomplete. The Red Forest featured only the Brainscorcher facility. The size of Army Warehouses was the same as in the final version, but the part outside of the base had basic terrain with nothing except a few trees and roads. Another test build was compiled in October 2003 and had number 1558. It was used mostly for testing vehicle physics and AI of new mutants like bloodsuckers. New types of drivable vehicles, including trucks and even convertibles, were available on the first version of the Yantari map. This is another level that is barely recognizable compared to its final version. Yantari from build 1558 had completely different terrain and featured buildings that never appeared anywhere else. Unfortunately, BTR-7T that can be found on this map is just a static object and you can't drive it, which is a real damn shame. This build also marks the first appearance of another iconic map, the abandoned city of Pripyat. Even though some fans of the series still believe that this level was a lot bigger and more open in S.T.A.L.K.E.R Oblivion Lost, this is another misconception that is not quite true. At the early stages of development, Pripyat had a slightly different layout, but the scale was closer to what we've got in the Shadow of Chernobyl. The most noticeable change is the lack of an apartment building that is separating the starting point from the main square. It was added closer to the release date in order to fix noticeable frame rate drops that were happening every time the player was looking in this direction. The final noteworthy prototype from the year 2003 was compiled in December and had the number 1632. It was the first build of the game that featured social interactions between Stalkers. Games from the S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise can hardly be imagined without those campfire conversations, and this is the moment where it all began. Though at this point it was only a scripted event, AI still had serious problems with pathfinding. Another interesting thing about this build is early versions of Dialogue and Trade HUD, though it didn't have any available options yet. Also worth mentioning that the territories around the base in army warehouses were expanded and received more detailed terrain. The end of the year has been marked by a leak of one of the old alpha builds from 2002, and it was deeply shocking news for GSC. The prototype that has appeared on the web has almost identical contents as the build 1114, which you could have seen at the beginning of this part of our story. It was well received by fans, and the contents of this alpha version were significantly outdated at this point, but this incident became a wake-up call for the team. The development of the game was going on for too long, and they couldn't keep adding new features and maps forever. The release date deadline was getting closer, and by the end of 2003 developers had made enough levels and other content. Now it was the time to put all those assets together and make something playable out of this. The last builds of S.T.A.L.K.E.R Oblivion Lost that are worth our attention have numbers 1828 and 1835. The first one was used for testing AI of another batch of new mutants like dogs and boars, and it also featured some new types of anomalies. In this build were added weapons attachments, consumables like food and medkit, and different types of armor. There was also a unique rusty car with broken windows and torn seats that never appeared in any other builds again. It's probably the same car that was mentioned in one of the anecdotes that you can hear around the campfires in the final game. Another feature of this alpha version is a mock-up of the PDA interface. At this stage, the only working functionality of PDA were the map with a few icons and filters and a connect tab where the player could communicate with other stalkers. Though those interactions were limited and in most cases NPCs were just telling you to piss off. Not very friendly, but considering how dangerous the zone is, I can't blame them for being too suspicious. Finally, a few days later, the dev team compiled build 1835 that had another batch of new maps. One of them was a Dark Valley, and it's so different from the final version, I wouldn't have recognized it if not for its name. In terms of terrain and layout, it was close to the garbage, and that's probably why it was completely remade later. According to design documents, this map was supposed to be a home for two rival bandit factions, Black Slime and Evil Dead. The idea of different bandit clans was eventually scrapped, but Black Slime was supposedly reworked later into Renegades, which has become one of the factions in S.T.A.L.K.E.R Clear Sky. Another shocking difference is the Red Forest, or to be more accurate, the lack of any forest on this map. The Brainscorcher part remained intact, but the rest of the level now was occupied by huge garbage heaps. To be fair, this design was actually closer to how it was in the real Chernobyl exclusion zone, because the Red Forest was bulldozed and buried in waste graveyards soon after the disaster. But still, this version of the map was kinda boring, so that's one of the few overhauls that I can get behind. The last interesting thing about this build is the first appearance of X10, which at this stage was called a war lab. At this point it was not as linear as it has become in the final version, though it was just as empty and boring as you could remember it. Originally, this map was planned to have the entrance to Pripyat undergrounds, but due to deadlines this idea was scrapped. X10 remained a dead end, just like every other lab in the game, and Pripyat undergrounds appeared only a few years later in Call of Pripyat. In February 2004, THQ announced in their financial report that the game was renamed once again, for the last time. The title was changed to S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl, and it was a sign that the publisher was getting ready for the final marketing push. A new planned release date was set to late 2004, but soon after this, something went wrong. As you may have noticed, during those 2 years when the game was known as S.T.A.L.K.E.R Oblivion Lost, the scope of the project was steadily expanding, but it was still missing the most important thing, the actual gameplay. At this point, the whole project was just a bunch of scattered levels and tech demos, but it didn't stop the studio from actively promoting the game and promising that it's going to be the next big thing. All this hype is the reason for the common misconception that once Oblivion Lost was removed from the game's title, the studio has been forced to tone down the original concept. But in reality, developers started to turn their ideas into something playable only when the game has become known as Shadow of Chernobyl. Soon after the title change, GSC prepared a new press demo that had the number 1844. It was shown at GDC 2004 and had several test levels to showcase weapons and physics of the game. On a shooting range, the journalists could try a few dozens of different guns and even practice on moving targets. For the game physics showcase, there was a room with different types of destructible objects, and also examples of close physics and dynamic lighting. The physics engine in this build looks quite impressive even by modern standards, and I can imagine the reaction of journalists who saw this demo for the first time back in 2004. But the main highlight of this build was the first appearance of the quest system. For this showcase, developers prepared a special mission that took place in army warehouses. The game starts in the building that will be used as Freedom headquarters in the final version. A wounded stalker is asking the player to find the bandit who's known as the Dog. He stole the artifact from the quest giver, so you need to kill this bandit and bring the stolen goods to the trader. After taking this mission, the player is free to explore the level and observe a live simulation in action. As a vertical slice of the upcoming game, this demo was doing a great job. Despite the lack of peaceful NPCs outside of the quest giver and the trader, Build 1844 was creating the feeling of a dynamic, living world. Mutants and stalkers were wandering around and doing their own thing without any scripts, and overall attention to detail was rather impressive. Advanced physics was here not just for show, they were used in the gameplay as well. For example, the player could kill the dying stalker by throwing the bolt into his head. Technically wise, this demo was looking quite good for its time. The models and environment were nicely textured and well animated, and it also featured dynamic weather with day and night cycle. The interface was far from final, but it featured such an interesting thing as a map with real-time NPCs movement tracking. The only downside was the lack of built-in ambient music support. So at this point, to fix this problem, developers made a batch file that was opening the playlist via a third-party audio player on the game's startup. For this build were prepared two music tracks, Ambience Number 2 and Battle XP Loop. They were written by a dark ambient composer known as Mu-Z, who will create most of the soundtrack for Shadow of Chernobyl and Clear Sky. Build 1865 from August 2004 was the first one that looked like a real game, even though it was still quite far from the finished state. This alpha version had 10 levels that were connected with each other, including completely new maps along with those that we've already seen. The game was starting at Siderovich Bunker on the cordon, but the only available mission in this build was about stealing the briefcase from a military blockpost. Outside of this quest, there was not much else to do at this point, except to wander around and observe the work of the Alive simulation at the bigger scale. One of the new levels that were available in this build was known as the Bar, and included territories around Rostok factory from build 1475. It had nothing in common with the map with the same name from the final game. It was a small town with a lot of open space, and the bar itself was located in the basement of an abandoned grocery store. The only person that you could have found here was the barkeep that was going to give you a mission. But it looks like the quest logic was not implemented yet, so the game is crashing every time you try to talk with him about this topic. Another interesting place on this map is the base of Duty, which has become one of the most important factions in the final game. Their base was located in a vegetable store, which is quite fitting if you'll ask me. Players could have also witnessed an amusing scene of duty members sleeping in the basement of this shop.
Ну здорово.
There were a few reasons why this level was completely scrapped a few months later. First of all, developers suddenly realized that it was too boring. This map had too many empty areas and was lacking in interesting landmarks. Secondly, it had a lot of geometry bugs, and the terrain overall required significant rework. Eventually, this map was cut from the game, and the location of the bar for stalkers was moved to the level known as Wild Territory, which we'll see soon enough. The old version of Yantari has been expanded and featured a more detailed terrain. Just like in the final game, this level was supposed to be the place with an unusual psi activity, which was studied by scientists from the camp on the edge of the map. Judging by the old design documents, the source of those psi emissions was supposed to be the mist creature, a mysterious mutant that could also create illusions and lure his prey into deadly traps. But in the end, it was reworked into the miracle machine, that was more of a tool rather than a living creature with its own will. In build 1865, the X-16 undergrounds were part of the main level, but they were rather simplistic at this point. The only interesting segments of this lab were the room with the mist creature and the underground train depot. As for the surface part of Yantari, in its current form it was a lot bigger than its final version, but at the same time it felt oversaturated with all those different buildings and other stuff. On this level you could find 2 abandoned villages, oil refineries, several defensive structures and a lot of other artificial objects with unknown purpose. Some of those buildings have noticeable wrong proportions and looked out of place on this map, and most of the textures were made in low quality. For the rest of the year, Yantari remained mostly untouched, and eventually the dev team decided to rework this map from scratch. Another interesting feature of this build were the new types of mutants, known as Bearer and Pseudo-Giant. And while Pseudo-Giant managed to make it to the final game, Bearer has become one of those unlucky mutants who had to wait for his chance to shine until Call of Pripyat. It was a dwarf-like creature that used his telekinetic powers to protect himself and attack the enemies. There were also added a few types of artifacts, even though they were presented only as a part of the environment, not as interactive objects that you could take and use. But the most surprising feature of the build 1865 was consumable animation for vodka. Okay, technically the protagonist actually didn't drink vodka, and it was just a looped animation sequence, but it's still impressive that someone actually put an effort into making this animation in the first place. Well, too bad it was removed from the final version. There are still not many games that dare to actually show the process of drinking the booze.
Я тебе порву, скотина! Де ти, курва, лазиш?
The main purpose of this alpha version was testing an early version of the Alive system on a scale of the whole world. So, as you can expect, it was kinda broken at this point. The Alive has already been able to create a believable simulation of the zone, especially in terms of mutants' behavior. But humanoid NPCs were often losing their minds and doing crazy stuff, like ignoring threats right in front of them. This alpha version was quite unstable. The fight between NPCs somewhere in other parts of the game's world was causing an application crash quite often. Also, in this build, even helicopters had free region from the scripts, and now you can see by yourself why they have appeared in the final game only as part of scripted events. At this point, Shadow of Chernobyl looked very promising, but there was still way too much unfinished stuff, and it was not just about unstable Alive simulation. Some of the levels had serious problems with geometry and textures, Places like Sidorovich Bunker had missing dynamic lighting sources, the sound mix was weird and still had no ambient music support. The interface was missing a lot of crucial functionality, like a menu for taking the loot from the corpses. The planned storyline was still not properly implemented. It was clear that the game wouldn't make it to the holiday 2004 launch window, so THQ agreed to delay Shadow of Chernobyl until the first quarter of 2005. If only they knew that this was just the beginning. The dev team was doing everything they could to not miss another deadline. At the same time, they still had to promote the game, so in September 2004 they prepared another build for the press showcase that had the number 9002. It was shown to Igromania, one of the biggest gaming magazines in the post-Soviet region, that eventually made a series of Final Hours documentary videos based on this build. Everyone, including developers themselves, believed that the game was close to completion and it will be released soon. The build itself was basically a more polished 1865 with only 3 first levels, but it featured additional quests and content. The main goal of the game was to find a gunslinger, which is basically an English translation of S.T.A.L.K.E.R nickname, but at this point this mission was just a placeholder. Developers finally implemented background music functionality, lighting and UI were improved as well. They also added to the player's PDA the first entries of a massive encyclopedia of the zone that were describing mutants, artifacts, factions and other info about the game's world. Since 9002 was basically just a demo version, it was only focused on the first impression, and that impression was really damn good. Graphics and sound design were outstanding for its time. The game constantly exuded feelings of gloom and dread. The zone felt like a truly dangerous and unpredictable place. Thanks to Alive, the game could have generated tons of unique situations that were not bound to happen on the new playthrough. NPCs were wandering around the levels and interacting with each other. Military forces were doing patrols, and stalkers were even hunting for artifacts. Developers added a few scripted events, like the wounded stalker in one of the abandoned houses, or another stalker who was robbed by bandits and asked the player for help. Though those scripts didn't work properly and were added only for demonstration purposes. But overall, at this stage, Shadow of Chernobyl was a true sandbox game at its core. The next build has an interesting background because it's the only official one. GSC released it on its community forum back in 2009 due to demand by their fans who still dreamed about Shadow of Chernobyl that was shown in the old gameplay videos. Build 9035 from October 2004 was basically a full version of 9002, and it was the closest thing to the original vision of the zone that developers wanted to create. This alpha version had 17 levels, which is almost every map that was planned for the final game. The only missing piece was the city of Pripyat, even though it was clearly visible on a global map. The Dark Valley was already replaced with a draft version of a new terrain that was missing a lot of details, which makes the lack of Pripyat even more strange. The old bar was replaced with the wild territory that is more or less the same as we've seen it in the final game. In this build, it was not yet separated into 2 levels and was a much more dangerous place, with a lot of controllers and other mutants wandering around. The legendary 100 Rats bar was located in the same old Fallout shelter, but it was rather empty at this point, and the barkeep looked like a normal stalker. Along with generators, Dead City and other maps that we've seen before, 9035 featured one unique level that appeared only in this build. It was known as the Swamps, and while it shared a few landmarks with the map from Clear Sky that had the same name, this version had a noticeably different layout. It was also located far to the north of the zone, while in Clear Sky it was a starting point of the game. This level was supposed to be a home for the Doctor, one of the allies of the player, and one of the most important characters in the Shadow of Chernobyl storyline. Now, since we have seen all of the levels that were originally planned for the game, it's time to put all the pieces together and see the whole picture. According to design documents from 2003, developers planned to turn the gameplay into some sort of investigation story, where the player was looking for the 7 pieces of information about the origin of the zone. And unlike in the final version of Shadow of Chernobyl, the game was not forcing the player to follow a specific path in order to reach this goal. At the start of the game, the player was supposed to receive clues about the last known location of 2 documents with the information he was looking for. But those clues were not simple waypoint markers like it's done in most open world games. Instead, you were basically getting a direction where to look for them, like find an abandoned underground lab somewhere in the dark valley, or something even more vague, like another stalker found the documents last time he was seen on the army warehouses. The starting set of clues was supposed to be random on each new playthrough, so the player couldn't predict where he could find all pieces of information this time. Each level was supposed to be some sort of puzzle that you had to figure out, either on your own or with the help of other stalkers. I've mentioned before that one of the main planned features of the Alive simulation was to make stalkers compete with the player. Now, just imagine that those madmen from GSC wanted to make NPCs compete with you not just for artifacts and loot, but for those pieces of information as well. Other stalkers could have traded those documents, or even tried to find all of them and complete the game instead of the player. Every faction also looked for this info and had their own intentions of what they wanted to do with it. Even Monolith members were supposed to actively participate in the search for these important documents. The remains of this idea can be seen when you look at Freedom and Duty factions. Their contradicting ideologies were added not just for the lore reasons. Helping one of those factions in their search was going to change the ending of the game significantly. It's hard to deny that the concept of a single-player game where the player is not the center of everything is quite ambitious, to say the least. Hell, in the year 2020 we still don't have anything like this, at least on the AAA market, where some random NPC can beat the game before the player does. Imagine Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but with a mercenary system that actually works, where they compete with you for the contracts, or can even kill some of the members of Cult of Cosmos themselves. Now you can understand why people were so hyped about Shadow of Chernobyl back in the early 2000s. This game could have become something truly groundbreaking. Unfortunately, one thing is to plan to do something, and the other thing is to make it real. I know it firsthand because this struggle is the same across all creative jobs, and game development is really no different. I hate to do this, but it's time to bring you back down to earth, guys, because by the end of the year 2004, the dev team had started to realize that their ideas were slightly more ambitious for what they could have achieved in practice. And Build 9035 is a prime example of why GSC was forced to tone down the original concept. The game was supposed to be released at the beginning of 2005, but it was still missing any functional storyline. Even side quests were not implemented yet. The game had the same 3 missions that you could have taken on the Cordon and nothing else. But the worst thing about this build was the problems of Alive that became really noticeable on a bigger scale. At first glance, everything was working great. It really felt like the world of Shadow of Chernobyl wasn't centered around the player. But the more you played this beta version, the more it was starting to fall apart. After a few transitions between the levels, Alive was going insane and could spawn literally dozens of mutants and NPCs in one place. Such disappointing bugs, along with frequent crashes and broken save files, were making the game almost unplayable and ruining the whole illusion of the living world of the zone. So, we've reached probably the most important point in our story about Shadow of Chernobyl. According to various articles and interviews about this game, The autumn of 2004 was the time when GSC had to completely revoke the original concept of the zone. Developers claimed that the main reason behind this decision was the feedback that they received from the first major playtests. They said that the game was praised for its impressive freedom and smart AI, but at the same time it was an unpredictable beast. Shadow of Chernobyl could have generated tons of memorable and unique situations, but in most cases all those exciting events were happening somewhere out of the player's sight. And without clear directions on where to go and what to do next, for most players the game was turning into a very boring experience, where you could aimlessly wander around for hours and literally nothing happened. That's the reason why most AAA developers are still too afraid to create true sandbox games with a non-linear storyline and minimal amount of scripts. And back in the 2000s, it was especially hard to convince the publisher to keep the development going after such negative feedback from the playtests. But honestly, there is one thing that bothers me about all this. I'm not denying that playtests in 2004 indeed played their role in the decision about the future of the Shadow of Chernobyl, but with all respect to developers, all those talks about how amazing a life simulation was, and the unprecedented freedom that the players had in this game, they just don't add up. Because I've played through dozens of different builds and basically followed the path that GSC went through all these years, and I haven't seen anything really comparable to this ultimate sandbox game that was supposedly playtested at the end of 2004. Even though I can't deny that what they've managed to achieve at this stage with Alive was indeed impressive, it was still quite far from the scale they were intended to reach. And lack of any signs of the planned story about looking for documents about the zone, not to mention even the basic side quest system, doesn't give much faith either. Maybe we are still missing some better versions from this period that had all those missing story bits and Alive without tons of critical bugs, but based on what I've seen in previous builds, somehow I really doubt it. Personally, I'm still convinced that making this overhaul was a huge mistake. Yes, at this stage the game was riddled with bugs and problems, but it clearly had enormous potential, and with more work, GSC could have succeeded with their original plans. But unfortunately, it would have required a lot more than a few months to fix all this mess. And if those playtests were done on the builds that we've seen, no wonder that THQ wasn't convinced that the sandbox without a linear story and scripts was something that Shadow of Chernobyl really needed, especially considering that 2004 was a golden age of linear first-person shooters. This year, the world has seen the release of Half-Life 2, Far Cry, The Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay, and many other great games in this genre. The world was simply not ready for something like Shadow of Chernobyl that existed in 2004. In any case, this is when the dream has died, and the nightmare has begun. – 2005 was the hardest year for developers of Shadow of Chernobyl. Based on the feedback from playtesters, GSC started to work on adding a new linear storyline, along with trying to fix Alive issues. One of their solutions were so-called smart zones that were supposed to attach some NPCs to specific locations. The dev team had to completely redesign several maps in order to make them fit in the new, more focused gameplay paradigm. It was a painful process, and the lack of experience in developing such huge and ambitious projects has started to cause a lot of serious problems for the team. Build 2205 from April 2005 was the first result of this massive gameplay revision, and yeah, unfortunately the difference was really noticeable. Honestly, I've experienced a culture shock when I've launched this build right after playing through 9035. Without a doubt, it was a major visual downgrade that developers probably had to do in order to improve the performance. To make things even worse, all the background sounds and music were missing from this build as well. The old atmosphere was ruined completely. It felt like a completely different game. For this beta version, the dev team has finally added a storyline and side missions, which is, to be honest, not a bad thing. You could play through the first hours of the story, which was more or less similar to what we've got in the final version. At the beginning of the game, the player had a strange vision in which a mysterious voice, supposedly the wish granter, was telling him to kill the gunslinger, aka S.T.A.L.K.E.R. Once the player was gaining control over the protagonist, he was greeted with Sidorwich, who briefly explains the basics of survival in the zone and gives the first tutorial mission. The storyline abruptly ends around the moment when you reach the bar and take the quest to find the documents from the X-18 lab. This build didn't have the Yantari map, along with some other late-game levels, so the player couldn't acquire Psy protection from ecologists to get to the north of the zone. And even with the help of the cheats, passing through the Red Forest was almost impossible due to constant crashes. With the addition of the main storyline, Shadow of Chernobyl finally started to look like a proper game, instead of a captivating but empty tech demo. But at the same time, that feeling of a living, breathing world from the older builds was lost in Oblivion. Yeah, that was an intended pun. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Anyway, the Alive system was still there, but in a more limited form. Some stalkers and mutants could freely move between the levels, but most NPCs were forever attached to those new smart zones. Compared to the build 1935, this one felt like a scripted playground, which was fun to mess around for a few hours, but it could have been something a lot more than this. As for other changes in build 2205, there were quite a lot of them, but most of the stuff will be interesting only for hardcore fans of S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise. I'll try to highlight only the most important details of this beta version before moving on to the next one. First of all, the cordon has received yet another revision, and this time it had a lot more hills. The iconic old factory from older builds was replaced with the familiar car park that was occupied by bandits. Just like in the release version, there was a side quest related to this place, but instead of rescuing the captured S.T.A.L.K.E.R, you had to steal the box with dynamite. It was probably the same box that Wolf from the Rookie Village took with him in the final game, though we'll never know how he intended to use it. The garbage was slightly modified and received the first version of a vehicle graveyard, though it didn't serve any real purpose at this point. The Agroprom and its undergrounds were separated from each other, and Wild Territory was also split into two parts, just like in the final game. But the most interesting changes happened with the Dark Valley. In build 2205, it was almost twice as big as the final version of this map. The factory with a hidden entrance to the X-18 lab had the same size as the bandit base on the northern part of the level, and it also played the role of the outpost of the Monolith faction. Build 2205 featured a surprising amount of working side quests and scripted events. For example, after entering the Dark Valley, you could surrender to the bandits' patrol, end up in the cage on their base, and witness a scene where bandits execute a S.T.A.L.K.E.R and throw his body to the pit with Bloodsucker. Though because of the voice placeholders for NPCs, at this point the scene looked rather comical. A lot of side missions that appeared in this build safely ended up in the final version of the game, like the infamous attack of Duty Squad on the Freedom Base in army warehouses. But in some cases there were slight differences, like that robbery scene that you could witness upon arriving on the garbage for the first time. In build 2205 it also included a broken car, so maybe developers were still planning to allow NPCs to control vehicles.
S.T.A.L.K.E.R. Спасибо, друг. Я твой должник.
Another noticeable difference compared to the final game is the questline about the crashed ecologist helicopter in the Wild Territory. In this version, it was a Freedom Squad who tried to retrieve the research data, not the mercenaries. This quest even had different outcomes. The player was not forced to help ecologists to escape the ambush. But in order to see them, you had to go back to the garbage where the ecologists group ended up due to the spawn error. They were asking you to bring the research data to the barkeep, and after that you were free to decide if you wanted to keep your word or make a deal with Freedom instead.
Черт, сколько можно ждать? Хорошо, хорошо. Я здесь быстрее, сколько можно ждать?
In Build 2205, developers added a bunch of new gameplay features, such as weapons durability and NPC companions system. Stalkers who weren't part of any faction and didn't have unique names could join the player and help him to survive in the zone. On the other hand, you could join Duty and Freedom factions once you complete their quest lines, though at this point it didn't affect your reputation. From other side activities, the player could try to participate in challenges in the arena and even place bets on how fast he will win. But this system wasn't fully implemented as well, so after killing the target, the scripts didn't work and the player could softlock himself from progressing further. From other stuff that didn't work, the day-night cycle in this build was disabled, so the sleep function was completely useless. There was the main menu screen, but at this point it was nothing but a placeholder without any real functionality. Build 2205 also featured a new mutant that was known as Islam, another one that was eventually removed from the game. It probably happened because of his animations. They were simply too slow, so the player could easily dodge his attacks. And since this mutant hasn't possessed any real threat, instead of revoking Islam, the dev team decided to simply get rid of it. Finally, it's time to talk about the most impressive feature of this beta version. 2205 really stands out compared to other builds from this period due to its stability. Unlike the build 9035 that was crashing almost every 5 minutes, I played through this beta version for a few hours straight until the Red Forest and encountered only 2 crashes. But this result was achieved at a high cost, and after this beta, the game has never managed to reach the scale that it had in build 9035. At the beginning of 2005, Shadow of Chernobyl became a different game, but the fans didn't know that yet. During the development of Shadow of Chernobyl, there were quite a few builds for testing the multiplayer modes. I didn't talk about them in detail because, personally, I never really cared about the online part of this game. And I'm convinced that the absolute majority of S.T.A.L.K.E.R fans are sharing this sentiment with me. But the build 2215 from April 2005 is important for our story for several reasons. And before we talk about them, let's take a quick look at the contents of this multiplayer beta. This build included 4 maps and 3 game modes: Deathmatch, Team Deathmatch and Artifact Hunt. The most interesting map from this beta is the Factory, because later it will be used as the foundation for a new version of S.T.A.L.K.E.R in a single-player campaign. To start a match, testers had to use the GameSpy launcher, and surprisingly, it didn't have any DRM protection. These days, it's hard to imagine something like this. Every internal beta version for AAA games have all sorts of protection to prevent leaks, from online checks to watermarks with testers' info. And developers of Shadow of Chernobyl probably deeply regretted that they didn't think about all this stuff in advance, because a few months later this multiplayer build leaked online. Unlike the previous leak that happened in the year 2003, this build was one of the latest beta versions that even included compilers and other X-ray engine tools. To make things even worse, the game files also contained resources for the single-player campaign, including storyline and quest descriptions. Rumors said that this build was leaked from one of the Ukrainian trading shows, where it was used for the promotional multiplayer tournament. In any case, GSC did everything they could to prevent the spread of this leak on the web, but it has become a final straw for THQ. After looking at this mess, the publisher sent Dean Sharp to the GSC office to take the role of executive producer and save Shadow of Chernobyl from development hell. But before we continue, there is another thing that makes Build 2215 so special. Even though this leak was undeniably a disastrous event for GSC back then, it also marked the beginning of the modding community for S.T.A.L.K.E.R games. Thanks to X-Ray engine tools from this build, fans have made first mods for Shadow of Chernobyl almost 2 years before the game was officially released. Along with fan-made bug fixes and custom third-party tools for adjusting in-game settings, modders even managed to convert single-player levels from the previous leak to this build and use them as multiplayer maps. Several total conversion mods that were made after Shadow of Chernobyl release were based on resources that were data mined from this build. It's hard to imagine S.T.A.L.K.E.R games without mods, and even though it happened under such troublesome circumstances, that's where it all began. Okay, let's go back to the end of 2005, when the dev team wasn't even sure that Shadow of Chernobyl would ever see the light of the day, hence thinking about stuff like modding support. The beta build 2232 from August 2005 can give us a picture of what Dean Sharp saw when he arrived at GSC office. It was obvious that the game was slowly becoming outdated. The X-Ray engine that looked impressive in 2004 was barely holding up with the latest AAA releases on the market. A major redesign of an entire game caused a whole new set of bugs and glitches, so in build 2232 everything was basically held together by duct tape. For example, to fix constant crashes, developers had to add seederage to every location. Even though this fix indeed helped to reduce crashes for whatever reason, it was clearly only a temporary solution. And not just because of gameplay and story logic reasons. Just look at how creepy this thing looked and sound. New issues aside, this beta version was a slightly polished build 2205 that was still missing a lot of stuff, mainly from the last parts of the game. Yantar was nowhere to be found again, but at least this time I've managed to play through the X18 lab questline. From what I could tell, at this point X18 had only slight differences compared to the final version, even though codes were the same. So due to the bug with physics, even after unlocking the door you had to use explosives to fully open it. There are a few differences in X18 questline, along with the monolith base on Dark Valley that I've mentioned before. After acquiring the documents, the player encounters another stalker who demands to give those documents to him. It's possible to talk him out and resolve this situation peacefully, but it's not like there were any consequences for this decision. This scripted event is one of the last remnants of the old Shadow of Chernobyl game design, based on the competition between the player and NPCs for pieces of secret documents. Also worth mentioning that the attack of military forces that happens once the player leaves the X18 underground was also done on a bigger scale. The military even had a PTR-70 that was crashing through the monolith base gates, but unfortunately there was still no way to take over this vehicle. Speaking about vehicles, the one thing that developers finally managed to fix was a helicopter AI. There were quite a few helicopters in this build that had a free region and were relentlessly attacking the player once they spotted him. You could even shoot down those helicopters and witness how they'd crash in flames to the ground. Another thing that was fixed in this build is that scene with an ecologist group that was attacked by Freedom on wild territory. The player still had a choice between helping Freedom or ecologists, but this time he had to escort ecologists group leader through the map. And it was not that easy to do that, because in this beta version he was moving too damn slow.
Отвали.
From other interesting features of build 2232, the dev team has added an ability to talk with wounded stalkers and give them meds. And unlike in the final game, the player could help even hostile NPCs that he just shoot. Though there was not much sense in doing this, because they remain hostile even after being saved. Ungrateful bastards. Mutant selection in the game was expanded with phantoms, which looked like zombies, but they had transparent and glowing skin. As for the common zombies, they received new voice lines, which honestly sounded comical rather than intimidating, as they supposed to.
Кто здесь? А ты кто? А ну давай это, как его, давай его, мочи, мочи! Опаньки. Кто там балуется? Я ща приду. Я вам бошки поотрываю.
As I've already said, technically wise there were quite a lot of problems. Even though this beta version was more or less stable during the gameplay, moving to another location was almost certainly causing a crash on the loading screen. Most of the available maps were compiled in low quality and looked really bad. Spawn points were located wrong, there were placeholders everywhere, and even the cordon was missing from this build for unknown reasons, so the game was starting right from the garbage. But to be fair, build 2232 had great dynamic weather, the sound was significantly improved, and overall, despite scaling down the scope of the game, it still had a lot of potential. Someone had to take control and help the team to finally get the job done, and that was the role that Dean Sharp had to take. Soon after arriving at GSC, he took over command for this project, set clear milestones and started to make difficult but necessary decisions. The dev team didn't really like that, but they were also understanding that they had no other choice, and it was their only chance to finish the game. After the press release about Dean Sharp taking over development broke the news, a lot of fans blamed him for dumbing down the game for the Western casual audience. But as we've seen, it was not quite true, and he joined the team once most of the gameplay redesign was already done. It didn't stop some of those fans to go as far as sending death threats to Dean Sharp, which is really disgusting and sad. Unfortunately, such toxicity is still a big issue in some of the gaming fandoms, so I feel that this example is a good excuse to once again remind everyone that such behavior is absolutely unacceptable. Developers are the same people just like you and me. Their works their ass off to make an entertaining game for you, and this is what they get in the reward when another unexpected delay or some other shit happens. In the case of Shadow of Chernobyl, all this pressure from publisher deadlines, from working conditions, from fans that were losing their patience, was badly affecting the dev team's morale. The end of 2005 was the most dangerous time in the history of this project, when even developers started to lose faith that they'd ever be able to finish this game. After another 6 months of hard and exhausting crunch, in March 2006 the work on the main storyline was finally completed. Build 2571 was the result of all those efforts that the dev team had to put in order to make it happen. This period of severe crunch led to a growing dissatisfaction with working conditions among the developers in GSC. Despite strong sales of Cossacks franchise and the fact that the studio kept receiving support from THQ, Sergei Grigorovich continued refusing to noticeably raise salaries of his employees. No one really complained about low pay until this time, because at the beginning of the 2000s working in GSC was considered to be a dream job. Back then, the management of the studio wasn't very strict, and working on such a game as S.T.A.L.K.E.R that gained cult following long before the release date was a big honor for many developers. But one thing is to work on a beloved project in which you have full creative control, and the other is to crunch for an entire year with strict deadlines, while being forced to remove features and content. And you had to go through all this while not getting properly paid for all your sweat and tears that you invested in this project. As a result, after a falling out with Krikorovich over wages at the beginning of 2006, several lead developers of Shadow of Chernobyl have left GSC. Shortly after, they founded 4A Games, a studio that is mostly known for their games from the Metro franchise. The funny thing about this whole story is that Dean Sharp also joined 4A Games a few years later and even became a CEO of the company. But back in 2006, things didn't look that fun, and there was still a game that they had to release. Despite leaving the studio, developers made an agreement with GSC management that they'll continue working on Shadow of Chernobyl at weekends after their main job. This fact, more than anything else, shows the level of commitment that those people had for this game. Despite all problems, they still wanted to make it happen, no matter what it takes. After 5 years of developing Shadow of Chernobyl, no one wanted to give up so close to the finish line, but there was still a lot of work to do. And now we are going back to build 2571 from March 2006, which was made during this extremely troubled period of the development of this game. This build had a near complete version of the main storyline that was only missing a few cutscenes. At this point, Shadow of Chernobyl looked fairly similar to the final game. You could even say it was in a playable state, since you could play through it from start to finish. But being in a playable state rarely means a stable and bugs-free experience in such cases. To put it lightly, build 2571 was a barely working nightmare, and it's a miracle that I've managed to reach the last levels. Of all alpha and beta versions of Shadow of Chernobyl that I had a chance to play, this one is definitely among the worst one in terms of stability. I swear, I have a lot of patience when it comes to dealing with bugs and crashes, and I can figure out a way to fix or at least bypass them. But my patience is not endless, and I've almost reached my limits while playing through this build. Seriously, I don't even know where to start. Most of the scripts in this beta version were completely broken. Random encounters and events were either not triggering or constantly repeating themselves every time you were re-entering the location. Life was only a shadow of its former glory. Stalkers were occasionally stuck in animation loops or simply losing their mind in the middle of the fight. I wasted a ridiculous amount of time on restarting my playthrough from backup saves and even manually editing script files to pass through specific parts of the game. And don't even get me started on the constant crashes that were bound to happen after playing this build for more than 5 minutes. I went through this hell so I could show you the next few minutes of the gameplay footage. So if you are still watching this video, you have my deepest gratitude. It means that all this suffering wasn't for nothing. In any case, time to take a look at the most interesting parts of this beta version. Overall, in build 2571 there were not that many changes compared to the final version of Shadow of Chernobyl. In the main questline there is one major difference. The big surprise was awaiting me during the second visit to Strelok's hideout in the Agroprom underground. Apparently, in this version of the storyline, mercenaries also found the hideout location and prepared the trap for the player. So after the explosion, instead of the cutscene like in the final game, mercenaries capture the player and bring him to their base in the Dead City. After waking up in the cell, you could talk with the doctor, who tells the truth about Strelok's identity and gives you the key from a secret stash in Pripyat. A few moments later, guards transfer Doctor to a different location, and after that his fate remains unknown. The player manages to escape from the mercenaries' base and leave the city only thanks to the sudden military raid. If you ever wondered why there was a mercenaries outpost in the northwestern part of the army warehouses, it was because they were guarding the entrance to the Dead City. And once this level was removed from the game, this outpost remained in the same place, even though it didn't serve any real purpose anymore. As for the Dead City itself, this level was slightly reworked after the last time we've seen it. In this build, it was populated with mercenaries and bandits, who had some sort of truce between each other. Each faction had its base located on this level. Mercenaries were occupying the sports complex on the central square, while bandits holed up in the school building on the southwest of the city. Since all these factions were hostile to the player, the only side quest that he could get here was from the doctor, who suggested stealing the map of Dead City from the bandits. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't find this item anywhere, and it's hard to tell if that's because I looked in the wrong place, or because of another broken script. The questline about X-18 lab was also slightly different compared to the final game. After the beginning of the military raid in Dark Valley, the player could steal a car and drive towards the south exit from the level. After smashing through the gates, the game was moving to the map that was known as the Darkscape. It was a narrow road between the mountains that connected Dark Valley and Gordon, and it played a very specific role in Shadow of Chernobyl. After the major redesign of 2005, developers realized that there was not much space left where the player could use vehicles that were still available in the game. To fix this issue, the dev team has decided to create 3 special levels just for the vehicle gameplay parts. Even their code names were starting from the letter K instead of L like other maps, which shows how different they were supposed to be from the rest of the game. For each of those levels, developers planned action-packed scenarios, where the player was driving through the different obstacles. On Darkscape, the player was trying to avoid military blockposts and ambushes, while also being chased by a helicopter. It was supposed to be a one-time experience. There were no side quests or secrets, and you just had to drive to the finish line and never return to these levels again. The other 2 vehicle maps were known as Dead Mill and Mill Rat, and just like Darkscape, those weird names were the combinations of locations they were connecting. Darkscape's purpose was to connect Dark Valley and Escape, which was the code name of the cordon. Dead Mill meant Dead City plus military, better known as the army warehouses, and the Mill Rat, military plus radar, which was the Red Forest. While the idea of special vehicle levels sounded promising, unfortunately, developers simply didn't have enough resources to make it happen. The game was falling apart, and spending the time on making even more new levels was a luxury that they couldn't afford. Before Dean Sharp took over the project, the dev team managed to finish only Darkscape and start the work on the geometry for Dead Mill. But once it was decided that vehicles will be removed from the game, the existence of those levels has lost its point. We can only guess why the Dead City was removed as well, but I believe that the reasons were similar to what happened with the vehicle levels. Since there was no conflict between mercenaries and bandits factions, and no mutants whatsoever, Alive couldn't create an interesting simulation on this map. After removing the swamp and blocking the entrance from Yantar, this level has become isolated from the rest of the game's world. So the function of the Dead City has been reduced to a simple decoration for one scene from the main story. Not to mention that if the player didn't follow the true ending quest line, he could easily miss this level entirely. Lack of time for doing another redesign of this map was probably the reason why developers have decided to remove it from the game. Mentions of Dead City and Darkscape have remained in the game files up until the release date, and players could still see those levels on the overhead map of the zone. As for other noticeable changes compared to the final game, Build 2571 had several scripted events that were removed a few months later. For example, once the player returns to the bar from the X-16 lab, he can witness a scene with an insane stalker who was captured near the entrance to the Red Forest. It was related to the personal story of a stalker known as Baldy, who's given Kill the Traitor side mission in the final version. Apparently, that insane stalker was one of his friends known as Spotty, who was left during the failed attempt to pass through the brain scorcher. This scene was ending with Spotty shooting himself in the head. So, who knows, maybe developers thought that showing suicide was too much even for such a dark game as Shadow of Chernobyl. Another two additional events were supposed to take place in Pripyat. Shortly after meeting the group of experienced stalkers, Monolith members used PTR-70 to ambush the player. Another difference compared to the final game was a scene at the end of the level. Once the player reached the Pripyat Stadium, he discovered that it was populated with 10 pseudo-giants, and the only way to the nuclear power plant was on the other side of this field. The military helicopter that appears out of nowhere and makes a few missile runs slightly helps to deal with this problem. But still, that was a pretty intense difficulty spike that felt like the final boss fight. So personally, I'm not surprised that it was eventually replaced with a non-interactive cutscene that you could have seen in the final game. Other than that, there was tons of less important stuff, like a very tight time limit in the X-16 lab. The player had only 1 minute to disable the Psy emissions generator. On the contrary, I feel that this last part of the game, where you had to jump through teleports on the nuclear power plant, was at least twice longer than in the final version. I lost count of how many teleport jumps I had to do before reaching the endpoint on the top of the main tube. The game was still missing the ending cutscene, so that was the reward for all my suffering. To be stuck here at the top of Chernobyl nuclear power plant, waiting for the next blowout so I could die before starving to death. Fate is such a cruel thing. Well, to finish this part on the brighter note, the last scene from build 2571 that I want to show you is the song that I was lucky to hear when I was passing near one of the campfires. If I'm not mistaken, there were no harmonica songs in the final version of Shadow of Chernobyl, which is a shame because they were quite nice.
Не кисло. Молодец. А еще что-то можешь?
During the whole 2006, GSC has focused on finalizing the work on the game. In May 2006, they prepared build 2559 for the E3 showcase, but it's not really worth our attention. It was basically a demo version that featured only the Agroprom level with its questline. A few months later, in August 2006, the dev team finally completed the work on the remaining content for the game. Build 2588 was almost identical to the release version of Shadow of Chernobyl, but there was still a lot of work to do in terms of stability and bugs. Some features like sleep functionality were sacrificed due to the high volume of errors they were causing. In the meantime, the fans who were still waiting for Shadow of Chernobyl were getting worried about the game for real. All those news about cut features and levels didn't give them any more confidence regarding the quality of the upcoming game. Almost 6 months later, after countless beta tests and sleepless nights that developers had to go through, the world has witnessed the moment that everyone has been waiting for. In March 2007, S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl has been officially released on the worldwide market. This long-awaited 1.0 version had a build number 2947. Despite the team's best efforts, it was not the most stable and bugs-free experience, and they had to spend another year patching up all the issues. And the fans' reaction was pretty mixed at first. Some people absolutely loved the game, while others hated Shadow of Chernobyl with passion. It was not a perfect game, and I can't deny that some of its criticism was justified, but that's another story. Maybe someday I'll return to Shadow of Chernobyl once again and make an in-depth review on it. Who knows, it's hard to make long-term plans at times like this, so we'll see about that. Shadow of Chernobyl has come through a difficult way. Together, we have followed the path that developers went through for 6 long years in order to create this game. From early prototypes and very first sci-fi concepts to numerous redesigns and cut features, you've seen how Shadow of Chernobyl has changed during all these years. Not many games allows us to follow through almost an entire history of its development, and that's another reason why Shadow of Chernobyl is so unique and special. The 2000s were a completely different time for the video gaming industry than now, especially when it was coming to PC exclusives. Making such an ambitious game as S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl was almost impossible without the financial and marketing support from a big publisher such as THQ. And when you accept this support, you can't just do whatever you think is right, especially when the early impressions from playtests are not so glowing. Maybe if this game was made now, the GSC could use the early access model to release the game that fans have been waiting for. But we have a lot of examples when early access was not the best choice for ambitious but inexperienced teams like GSC were back then. And without guidance from the publisher and producer like Gene Sharp, no one could have helped them to save the game if things go wrong. The creators of Shadow of Chernobyl were dreamers who dared to try to break the rules, but the lack of experience almost ruined the whole project. But even after significantly scaling down their original ideas and going through development hell, in the end they still managed to develop a great game. Despite all problems and cut features, the release of Shadow of Chernobyl has marked the beginning of the S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise that still has a lot of devoted fans around the globe. At the moment of making this video, GSC is developing a full-fledged sequel that is planned to be released in 2021. And unlike Shadow of Chernobyl, this time the studio prefers to carefully give new bits of info about their new project and still hasn't shown any gameplay. It shows that GSC has learned the lesson and clearly understands now the danger of setting the wrong expectations. Though it's not like they need to do anything special to promote S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2. This is the game that fans were dreamed about for 10 years at this point, and making a game that won't shatter those dreams is not going to be an easy task, so I wish the dev team the best of luck because they'll need it. Before we conclude this documentary, I want to talk about something I've been thinking a lot lately. At the moment of recording this video, a few weeks ago the world has seen the release of another enormously ambitious game. Yes, I'm talking about Cyberpunk 2077. And you know, the more I look at this situation, the more I see similarities compared to what happened with Shadow of Chernobyl. Think about it. Cyberpunk 2077 is a game that gained a cult following long before the release date, but it was overhyped and badly mismanaged, and currently it's facing a backlash for bugs and removed content. We even have a bunch of morons who were harassing developers over delays and other stuff. I wasn't able to play Cyberpunk 2077 yet, but something tells me that it's not a bad game either. And I wouldn't be surprised if CD Projekt Red will be able to fix most of the issues within the next year and turn around this whole situation. What I'm trying to say is that Cyberpunk 2077 is not the first overly ambitious game that failed to live up to the hype, and unfortunately it definitely won't be the last one. The lesson is simple: never fully believe in marketing tricks and always temper your expectations about upcoming games. I'm a big fan of the S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise, and I'm excited to play the sequel in the future. But I'm not expecting that GSC will release the best game ever made. And even if S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 won't be perfect, I doubt I'll be disappointed as long as I'll have fun while playing it. So let's hope they will succeed and make a game that will be worth waiting for. Wow, it's hard to believe that I'm finally done with recording this video. You know, this documentary is bigger than anything else that I've done before, and to be honest, I didn't expect it'll take so much time to make it. Originally, it was supposed to be a simple compilation with short gameplay clips from each alpha and beta build of Shadow of Chernobyl, but at some point I've realized that it's important to provide the context for all this footage. My life is quite a mess right now, and all those personal issues have noticeably limited the amount of time that I can spend on creating reviews and essays for my channel. But this video is something that I wanted to create, no matter what it takes, and I hope it was worth it and you had fun while watching it. I'm not sure when I'll be able to make another big documentary like this one, but this is definitely the type of content that I wish to create more in the future. So if you enjoyed this video, then I'll really appreciate it if you'll decide to share it among your friends and subscribe to my channel. In any case, thanks for watching and stay safe.